BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays this year I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And last week on Cooper Friday, I was joined by Ryan Burns of the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, who was talking to us all about the D.B. Cooper suspect Richard Floyd McCoy. And in the second part of that interview, which I'll play for you in just a second, Ryan and I were talking more about the forensics, the other suspects, and the entire investigation. One more time, Ryan Burns runs the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, and I would like to give a shout out to YouTube user Parents2090, who said that if this takes place, I deserve a free Dr. Pepper, my favorite Zodiac researcher and my favorite D.B. Cooper researcher doing collabs. All right, Parents2090, you're the one who set this thing off, and you can email me at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, and we can talk. And I also want to remind you guys that you can download the audio version of this program on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts, for free under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And let's welcome Ryan Burns back to the channel.
You know, he sat there with the stewardesses on 2 days after the hijacking and drew that nose on a piece of paper because they told him to draw that nose. And the stewardesses said, hey, and the stewardesses, after the sketch was done, they said, we approve of this sketch. Bill Mitchell, the passenger who sat next to Cooper, or across the aisle from Cooper, he saw that sketch. He had no problem with it. And so you would think that if the guy's nose, you would think that that nose is so strange in that sketch, but apparently that's just what his nose looked like. So he got that in the descriptions a lot. Also, they talk about how his face was very narrow. They dismiss a lot of suspects' photos because their face is too wide. They'll say, oh, no, Cooper's face was narrow. He had a narrow face. Also, Cooper had this weird lower lip. Something was weird about his lower lip. The stewardesses, two different stewardesses on two different occasions described his lip as pouty, that he had a pouty lower lip. Another stewardess called it protruding. Okay. So he had this thick, they've also called it thick. So thick, protruding, pouty. Something was unique about his lower lip. And so we have this, and this isn't from the sketches, this is just from their descriptions of looking at suspects. So Cooper needs to have a narrow face, a weirdly small nose, and something weird about his lower lip. And also he needs to be darkly complected, because all of our witnesses said he was olive skinned. They even used that term olive. 4 different people use the term olive. They don't say dark or medium dark, they call olive. So he had this sort of, and these are people who saw him. Often people will say, well, they thought he looked dark because the plane didn't have good lighting. No, well, the gate agent and the ticket agent thought he had a dark complexion. So, and the stewardess, the only stewardess who he interacted with without his sunglasses on, Florence Schaffner, she had several interactions with him before he became the hijacker. She served him his drink. She took his ticket. She said, she told the FBI 10 minutes after getting off the plane that he had a Latin appearance. He looked Latin, she said. And then another passenger said that he looked a quarter Mexican or Native American. So he needs to have this narrow face with a small nose and kind of have this Latinish vibe to him a little bit. Okay. And these are things that come up repeatedly. If it was one passenger saying it, that's one thing. But these are the things that are consensus among all the passengers. So we can narrow suspects down, like a guy like Walter Recca, who's a suspect some people like. Walter Recca is fair-skinned with this really flat, huge nose. And just not the guy. And his head is real widely, little blockhead kind of, shape to his head. So I don't think we're going to find Cooper, but we can at least, it's easier to narrow it down. I mean, if somebody brings me a suspect, and I see their photograph, I'll still look into you, even if your photograph doesn't look like Cooper, but I would just say, look, if you have a suspect whose nose is big, well, that's not Cooper. Sorry. Try again.
I'm so glad that you talked about what I expect is Composite A that has that extremely narrow nose shape, because that was one of my immediate responses when I first saw that thing years ago, even before I was closely following the DB Cooper case. I thought that it looked extremely
Yeah,
unnatural because, like, it's just so incredibly narrow.
bizarre.
It's bizarre, yes. But
But
Ryan, I
yeah,
have a question for you.
yeah.
If Richard McCoy wasn't DB Cooper, and you think this case might not be solved, is there any other suspect that you think highly of? Is there any other suspect that is viable?
Ooh. Um. Well, there are a few who are kind of off the radar. Who uh, there's a guy named Orville Lyons who I'm interested in, who was found. Orville Lyons was this kind of vagrant fella who was from Delaware originally, and he had been in the Marine Corps in Korea and was wounded. And after the war, after Korea, he just kind of drifted around, was never really married or anything, and ended up in. He had been part of a smoke jumping team, and smoke jumping kind of. There's a lot of correlations between Cooper and smoke jumpers that people like. And Lyons was actually he had lived in Portland and in Seattle around that time. And he wasn't turned into the FBI until the early 80s. And they find this guy when the FBI, they send a lead. What they see, so these agents, what they would do is so Lyons was believed to be living in Mississippi, where I am, of all places, at the time in the early 80s. And so the Seattle office, who's in charge of the FBI case, they send their case files to the FBI office in Jackson, Mississippi, and say, "Hey, go find this guy and talk to him." Okay. So when they approach Orville Lyons, who's just hanging out in Mississippi, he's working at he's a handyman at a hotel. They approach him and they go, "Hi, we're agent so and so. We're at the FBI." He blurts out, "Is this about the hijacking?" Now, this is in 1984. And he has no idea why these guys are coming to talk to him. But he goes, "Is this about the hijacking?" And it's interesting. We actually in the FBI files, we can see the FBI's notes that they sent to Seattle, these agents in Mississippi. And they're like, "Oh my God." They're like, "Before we even mentioned anything, he asked if this was about the hijacking, and they're going, 'Oh my God.'" And so they even remark, they say, "This guy looks like the sketches to us. He's swarthy complected." And he had a limp. And they asked him where he got the limp. And he said, "Oh, I got this limp in the fall of 71. He says he fell out of a tree in the fall of 71. Well, okay. And in the fall of 71, they said, where were you living?" "I was living in Seattle at the time." So he falls out of a tree in Seattle and, limps around. So he has a limp. He's a smoker, real polite, no accent. Lyons he looks, I found a yearbook photo of him when he was younger. He looks a lot like, he has the narrow face, a pouty lip, a weirdly thin nose. I like Orville Lyons a lot. I think that we don't have the complete files on him yet, so I don't really know why he was eliminated. My guess is that they showed his photograph to the stewardesses and they eliminated him. But we know, I don't take any stewardess eliminations really much. I don't give them much credit on that in the 80s or whatever, because we actually have the stewardesses, we have their actual documents with the FBI where the primary stewardess who interacted with Cooper for hours, 5 hours, Tina Mucklow, we have her a year later in 72 saying that the hijacker's face is becoming kind of murky to her. She goes, "It's becoming foggy in her memory." And then a year later, she says, "I can't remember what he looked like." Florence Schaffner, the other stewardess who interacted with him, she lasts until about 1975, and she finally tells the FBI, "Hey, look, you should probably stop. You should probably stop showing me photographs because I can't remember what he looked like anymore." So, any eliminations from the 80s, 90s, or something by photographs, I don't put a lot of stock in. So I think that's probably how they eliminated Lyons. But I like this guy a lot. Milton Vordahl is an interesting suspect. My website, norjak.org, that's norjak.org, has a lot of information about him. He's interesting. He has a lot of connections to these tie particles. There's a guy named Jason Langseth, who was the most highly investigated suspect by the FBI. He was investigated by them in 4 different decades. they investigated this guy in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He did offer his DNA finally as an old man in 2003, and the DNA was no match to the Thai DNA, but I don't put a lot of stock in the Thai DNA. But Langseth was practicing night jumps in the months before the hijacking. He was a skydiver. He was a sleazy con man, essentially, real sleazy. And when he was a industrial chemical salesman, which is interesting because there's all these Thai particles that people talk about on the Thai. Well, this guy was an industrial chemicals salesman, and they asked him where he was. When the FBI caught up with him, several people turned him in after the hijacking. Said, "Hey, why don't you investigate this guy?" He had been talking about, we had known this guy was doing night skydives. He had talked about committing the perfect crime, all this sort of stuff. And so when they go and asked Langseth where he was on November 24th, 71, he goes, "Well, I was selling chemicals outside Colorado Springs." And they go, "Well, can you prove that somehow?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I can give you my logbook for that day, showing where I made all these visits." And they go, "Okay, well, you bring this to us next week or whatever." So he brings this logbook of all his for the past year or whatever. And when they looked up the names of these businesses that he had been visiting on November 24th, they were fictional businesses. He had made them up, and a few were real. And when the FBI called them, they said, "We have no memory of a guy like that showing up here selling stuff." So he lies to the FBI, which is a crime in of itself, right? So, I mean, who lies to the FBI about where they were on November 24, 71, right? So he's a very intriguing suspect. Now, his photo was shown or at least one of his photos was shown to a stewardess, and she said it wasn't him. So, and that was in 72, so maybe her memory was still good. So that hurts him a little bit. But he otherwise looks a lot like Cooper, and he was receiving, they found out in the 80s that he had been receiving money, monthly stipends from a Canadian bank account every month in the 70s and 80s. So that's kind of mysterious too. And when the FBI went up to Canada to go ask this bank about it, the bank said, "You have no jurisdiction here, and we don't talk about our customers, so piss off." So the FBI did. So interesting guy. Langseth's really interesting. This guy named Orville Lyon is interesting. And there are a few other people out there who are kind of being developed as we speak. But Skip Hall is a recent suspect that people like. Lauren Hall. I would advise you to get John Limbach on your show. He's written a book called "Where Was Skip?" about this guy. Remember we talk about how Cooper looked Latin appearance, or had a Mexican vibe to him. Well, Skip Hall was a Cuban. He was an American, but he was a Cuban freedom fighter, and he would go around America collecting donations that he would just pocket. But he would collect donations, and he would go speak at like 4A clubs and things, or Rotary clubs, and he pretended to be Cuban. His name was Lorenzo Pasillo. His real name was Lauren Hall, but Lorenzo Pasillo would go around collecting donations, and he worked in aviation in the late 70s or in the late 60s. He worked for Northrop Aviation, which could explain the Thai particles. He has kind of a strange lower lip as well. So Skip Hall is a really interesting suspect, and don't know if he's Cooper, but he's interesting. So there are guys out there, and I would say that our suspects have gotten better, okay, over the years, because now we've got the internet and we have the FBI files. Our suspect pool has gotten better. For so long we had the same suspects, guys like Dwayne Weber, Wolfgang Gossett, Barb Dayton, the transgender Cooper, McCoy, all the ones you see on all the documentaries, right? It's all the same people. Or LD Cooper, we call him Uncle LD. That's the blonde Marla Cooper in all the documentaries, the attractive blonde lady who said that her uncle was Cooper, right? We have these people like that. But then we have these newer suspects, and the newer suspects are a heck of a lot better, I think, than these older suspects. So, and it's getting better. I mean, we're getting better and better suspects as we go along, people who I'm more likely to think could be Cooper. But none of them really, that I know of, other than Orville Lyons, really make me go, like really, at this point. But I'm always open to new suspects, coming out of the woodworks.
Okay, Ryan. So, how are you doing on time? Because I
I'm
would
good.
like to have a couple questions for you. And
Perfect.
if you got some time right now, what
I
would
have
you
I
rather
have all
do?
the time in the world.
Amazing. And would you like to talk about the suspects again with some rapid fire questions, or would you like
Yes,
to
sure.
talk about the DB Cooper heist? Which direction should we
I
go
mean,
in?
I mean, we'll do both, but start with suspects since that's what we're talking about already.
All right, and in the rapid fire tradition, like a real brief reason about, what is good
Sure.
about this suspect, what is bad. And I have to begin with one that you brought up. What do you think about Milton Vordal? Because as I thought you would have put Milton Vordal much higher on the list than anything that you just said right now. But what do you think about Milton Vordal?
Okay, so Milton Vordal is the best suspect. Look, I worked on the team that found Milton Vordal, and he's the best suspect that we could come up with based on the tie particles. Okay, he was this mad scientist essentially, but the knocks on Milton are that he was 58 at the time. Now, a lot of people said that he looked younger, so possibly, but he was 58 at the time. We have no idea that he had ever skydived or put on a parachute in his life. And this was a skydiving heist. So I do think that Cooper had some parachute experience. Also, like practical aviation experience. Over the past year, I've really begun to think that Cooper really had some sort of aviation knowledge. The pilots themselves were saying, this guy back there seems to know a thing about an airplane. Now Milton Vordal was a literal genius. Like people throw around that word a lot, but he was a literal genius. He made contact lenses for his kids. I mean, he was a genius inventor with like 80 something patents. So if he wanted to be, and he was a real misanthrope too. He was a real jerk. He called humans Homo sapiens. Like he had a real disrespect for other people. So he could be a hijacker, sure. But I mean, and he was unemployed at the time. He had lost his job in August of 71. So when there were a bunch of layoffs at his titanium factory he worked at in Nevada. So he's a good suspect, but the age hurts him, and also the not having like parachute training and stuff kind of hurts him a lot.
Okay, then. I've done a recent book discussion on Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins, and their
Okay.
suspect is Kenny Christensen. What do you think about him?
Okay, so Kenny Christensen was small. He's about 5'9". Okay, and he was bald. Okay, now we have the eyewitnesses. They asked them, they said, do you think Cooper was wearing a wig? What's funny enough is two of the stewardesses were like, we wear wigs. We know what wigs look like. Cooper was not wearing a wig, okay? Kenny Christensen was literally bald in 1971, like bald, okay? Completely bald in 71. He was 5'9". Cooper, I mean, all of the eyewitnesses except for one who actually saw Cooper standing listed him as at least 6 foot tall. So he was a taller man for his time. Okay. He's 5'9", and he worked for the airline. He worked for Northwest Orient. Okay. So, I mean, and he continued to work for them for 20 years. Okay. So why, I mean, he ran a legitimately serious chance of, he was a flight attendant himself. He was a purser. So he ran a good chance of actually like running into one of his victims. In fact, Tina Mucklow ended up working on the Far East route for most of the 70s with Northwest Orient, where they'd fly to the Philippines or Hong Kong or wherever. And that was the route that Kenny Christensen worked on all those years. So, I mean, I would love for someone to ask, if I ever meet Tina, what's one thing I'll ask her, say, look, did you know Kenny Christensen? And I'm sure she'll say yes, because we actually met last year at CooperCon. This is a plug for anybody out there. dbcooperevents.com. Come to CooperCon. You will not regret it. It is awesome. It is in Seattle. It's at the Museum of Flight. That is the coolest aviation museum I've ever been in. They're opening up the 727 for us to go inside this year. That is not usually a thing that's opened up. So we're getting to go into an original 727, and we can see where Cooper sat, and see how close everybody was and all that stuff. But anyway, we met a flight attendant there. who was an older woman. She was working at the museum as like a greeter, essentially. And she had worked at Northwest Orient in the 60s and 70s. And she knew all the flight attendants in the Cooper story. She knew the pilots, and she knew Kenny Christensen. And she said that it was like an inside joke among Northwest Orient that Kenny was Cooper because he was so mild-mannered and kind of meek. And they would just tease him about it. And he played along with it, So, I mean, when they said that when she was saying that in the early 2000s or whenever that documentary, when the book came out and when there was a National Geographic called The Skyjacker That Got Away, which is about Kenny Christensen, she said her jaw was on the floor, like, oh my God, like that was our joke. Like people are like actually believing our joke now. Like, what is this? So, the big knock on Kenny is bald, too small. And why do you hijack your own airline? Like he literally, again, I mean, he didn't know who was going to be on that flight as far as the stewardesses go. Florence Schaffner might have known Kenny Christensen. Okay, he hands her the note and she goes, Kenny? What is this, a joke? Oh, ha ha, it's not April Fool's yet, Kenny. What are you doing? I mean, so like he worked for this company that wasn't a very big company. So it really doesn't make sense that he would do that. Poor suspect, in my opinion.
Okay, then, what do you think about Ted Braden?
Okay, so I call Ted Braden the god of circumstantial evidence. He is, Ted's one of my first loves. He's like the high school girlfriend kind of. Ted is the first suspect that I ever came across that I was like, this guy could be DB Cooper. And I am kind of known, Drew Beeson's obviously Ted Braden's guy, or Ted Braden is Drew Beeson's guy. But I would say behind Drew, it's me who has promoted Ted Braden the most. And I could still see a universe where Ted Braden is Cooper, but he's got two big knocks on him, really. He's small. Ted Braden was about 5'8". Okay. I mean, I guess he could have worn shoe lifts or something to make himself look smaller as part of a disguise. The CIA, which Ted Braden was a part of, did do that. They did have disguises and things. It was possible. Braden's nose is a little big. I don't like his nose size, but really that's it. Ted Braden is, if you could invent, I often tell people that if you just gave 100 people all the facts of the Cooper case and said, just invent DB Cooper, 75 of 100 would invent Ted Braden. Just this guy was one of the best skydivers in the world at the time, who was actually a criminal. Okay, so you have a thief who is a badass skydiver this guy was in Vietnam. When he was in Vietnam, he was training. ARVN is the Army of Vietnam. That's the South Vietnamese Army, who were our allies in the Vietnam War. Ted Braden trained ARVN Special Forces to land into trees because they were jumping into the central highlands of Vietnam where all these jungles were, right? So he actually trained people how to land in trees. And this guy jumped, he did halo jumps and things into North Vietnam, okay, on these small teams in the Vietnam War. This guy was as brave as they come. So jumping out of a plane, out of a 727 into Clark County, Washington, is like a Tuesday afternoon to him. I mean, it's nothing to him. Okay, so that would have been nothing to Ted Braden. He would have had no fear of this hijacking. And Cooper was exceptionally calm for the most part. So this is the kind of guy you would think. So, and Braden is actually one of the few, he's probably the only suspect that I know of who we can legitimately say more likely than not knew that people had jumped out of 727s before. Okay. I don't know maybe some suspects somehow knew that, but he's the only one who more likely than not did know that the CIA, because we worked for the CIA, did know that they were putting guys out, of 727s and doing cargo drops and things in Vietnam out of 727s. So he would have known that you can do this, which gives him a lot of good points. But again, 5'8". We've got two of the stewardesses and the gate agent have Cooper at 6'1", even. So 5'8" to 6'1" is pretty drastic, really. People aren't great about getting precise heights on people when they're eyewitnesses, but a height disparity of that much, of half a foot, is pretty drastic, I would think. But no, Braden's great. Braden is a great suspect, except for his height, really.
Okay, then we have to do a follow-up with that, because this actually comes to us from Drew Beeson, and he asked it to his audience. He is the host of, well, his channel is named Drew Beeson. He also hosts the Zodcast, and he said that if you could choose any of the widely discussed DB Cooper suspects to recreate the DB Cooper skyjacking, or which suspect would you go with if you wanted them to successfully pull off a skyjacking like that? Who would you choose?
It's easy. I mean, that's a billion out of a billion times I would pick Ted Braden. Absolutely.
I would too.
I mean, like I said, I mean, nobody. I mean, yeah, just, I mean, literally, this guy would enter. So the Army, he was in the Army at the time, and when he was stationed, like in Germany or wherever he was, he would enter local skydiving competitions, like representing the Army, and win them. Okay, and he would give the trophies to whatever the commandant of their local fort, wherever he was, was. It was wherever he was, he would give the trophy to the guy, to the general in charge of that facility, right? Wherever he was staying. So, I mean, this guy was as good as they came. I mean, 911 skydives. And a lot of these were at nighttime. So, yeah, a billion times out of a billion, Ted Braden, without any doubt, 100%.
Okay, then. This is a suspect that I have not done an individual episode on this channel before. And every suspect I've asked you previously about, I have standalone episodes about here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, people can hit the like button and subscribe if they want to follow along with Cooper Friday, talking about all things DB Cooper. But what do you think about Vince Peterson?
Oof. Probably the worst. I mean, probably the worst suspect that has ever been put out into the mainstream.
Oh, did you hear that, Eric Eulis?
Yes. It is literally as bad as it comes. I mean, as bad as it possibly could get. It's bottom of the barrel. I mean, and like, Eric is a friend of mine. Okay, and that's but bottom of the barrel.
Wow, seriously, right? Wow.
Well,
okay, I got to hear these explanations. Let's hear it.
Okay, I mean, for one thing, he looks like Jay Leno. His chin is enormous. That chin would not escape notice. Okay, for one thing, he has bright blue eyes. Okay, fair skin, very fair skinned. Nothing about him looks Native American or Mexican. Okay, zero criminality in his background. I mean, we joked about how Vincent Peterson and Milton Bordahl kind of came out at the same time, and we have these op-eds that Bordahl wrote that I found on the internet, where he's writing about abortion and things. And he's like, "Oh, your aborted baby is no different than eggs we flush down the toilet." I mean, just like crazy crap, real misanthropic. I mean, Milton Bordahl supported eugenics, apartheid. I mean, he was a villain. Okay, like a Batman villain. The one op-ed we ever found that Vincent Peterson wrote to a newspaper was that kids should wear their life jackets when they go out on the lake. Like, make sure your kids have their floaties on. Like, this guy is not hijacking a plane, threatening to murder everybody on it. Okay. Again, and also there is literally nothing to connect him to the Pacific Northwest. He was from the Bronx, so he had an accent, I'm sure. Okay. He was missing part of his finger. Okay. I remember I called Eric when he announced Vincent Peterson, when we'd already looked into him, and was like, "Eric, this guy didn't have a finger. I mean, he's missing part of his finger." And Eric's like, "Oh, it changes nothing." I'm like, "What are you talking about? Like, changes nothing? Like, if you're missing part of your finger, if you have any sort of deformity, you're going to cover it up, like McCoy did with his scar, right? All you have to do is wear gloves, and nobody's going to see your nubbing pinky finger, But just the way that Eric came up with Vincent Peterson was poor. He went to this place called Rim Crew, which was where some of us think the tie particles came from. And he talked to a 90-something-year-old guy and said, "Hey, who did you work with in like 71 who was about 50 years old and was tall?" Literally, that's all he said. "Who did you work with who was about 50 years old and was tall?" The guy goes, "Oh, it sounds like Vincent Peterson." That's all Eric needed. Vince Peterson is now DB Cooper. It's like, well, wait a second. Don't you want to look into this guy's personality? Well, don't you want to talk to his kids and see where he was at the time? Was he ever laid off? No. This guy didn't have any money trouble. He was upper middle class. Did fine. Was not. I mean, we have him we have him going. Rim Crew Crucible Steel, his company he worked for. We have him in like January, I think, of '72. So 2 months after the hijacking, he's being sent to conferences by Crucible. So this guy's not like laid off. It's not like he's unemployed, And again, let me just go back to this. I feel like your audience should know this. Like, we think about this flippantly, this hijacking. Oh, well, nobody was hurt, yada, yada, yada. But like, picture yourself hijacking a plane tomorrow. Okay, picture yourself literally walking onto a plane tomorrow and being like, I'm going to kill all you people unless you give me money. Like, this guy actually woke up out of bed that morning and went and did this. Like, Cooper was a criminal. Okay, we like to make him like he's Han Solo with a business suit or something. He's not. He was an asshole. I mean, he was a hijacker. Like, none of these guys were pleasant. Okay, so I mean, things could have gone horribly wrong. I mean, he could have gotten people killed that day. So Vincent Peterson, there is, I mean, literally nothing. If you go to the Wikipedia article, I mean, all it can possibly say is he worked at a place where they think the tie came from. Well, that's it. I mean, there is literally nothing else on this guy. So no, he is he had, like, we have photographs of Vincent Peterson as an old man. Okay, in the early 2000s, even late 90s, early 2000s, he has hair that would make me so jealous. Okay, I mean, he has a ton of hair as an old man. DB Cooper was described as having a receding hairline, and one of the stewardesses even called him balding, slightly balding, like a bald spot. I mean, so like, there's no way Cooper has his hair 40 years later or whatever, 30 years later. So Vincent Peterson is preposterous as a suspect.
Okay, then, the final suspect that I will ask you about is someone with a very similar name. What do you think about Sheridan Peterson?
Okay, Sheridan, like I just mentioned about Vincent Peterson, the personality is not there. Sheridan Peterson was a good guy. The only arrest Sheridan Peterson ever had in his life was when he was arrested in Mississippi in the early 60s during a sit-in, like, for civil rights. Like, so he was down there, like, for, trying to do civil rights, stuff, and was arrested. Like Bernie Sanders was arrested doing that, right? Famously, it was very similar. He spent time in the 60s in Vietnam doing nothing but helping war refugees, like humanitarian stuff. He was not a bad guy, Peterson. He was also balding. He was basically mostly bald. We have his passport photo from '72, and he's pretty much bald. Okay, he had people who knew him, including one of my friends who knew Peterson, said that he had like shockingly, like, unforgettable bright blue eyes. Okay, well, the eyes that Florence Schaffner looked into and gave her a death stare, she described as dark and brown, right? But he's bald, and he was in Nepal at the time. I mean, the FBI is pretty sure that he was in Nepal, living in like a hut, fathering children, because he had several children in the early 70s in Nepal. So, like, he wasn't even, Peterson wasn't even in the same hemisphere of the planet at the time. I mean, he was an early suspect and a logical suspect. I'm sure, because he worked for Boeing. He'd even done a stunt. Peterson had even done a stunt in the early 60s where he jumped for Boeing, a publicity stunt where he jumped out of a Boeing plane wearing a business suit. So, like, I get it. But again, you look into the guy and he's got bright blue eyes and he's bald and he's not a villain, not even remotely. And he's not even on the same hemisphere of the planet at the time. So I could see why people would think he'd be a good suspect because of his skill set. He was a expert skydiver and a smoke jumper and all this other stuff, but he just wasn't. It's not in his character to do this, and he's got a really good alibi as well.
Now, when I did my episode on Sheridan Peterson, it was my understanding that he claimed that he was in Nepal at the time, out of the country, but that was not verified. Like, they didn't have a way to confirm that. Is that true or false?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they could actually confirm that, but his passport wasn't stamped that he had come back. There was no, I mean, now back then maybe it's a little different, but the FBI could not actually confirm that. But there's that. Yeah. So I mean, I guess that is some kind of mystery there. But again, he doesn't look like Cooper. I mean, his face isn't narrow. And back then it wasn't particularly narrow. Again, he's bald and bright blue eyes, but he's just not Cooper. I mean, and he gave his, he freely gave his DNA up to them, and I believe him when there's a great documentary where he's a pretty old man, and he's like, "I'm a good guy. This Cooper guy was a bad guy." I mean, I believe him. There's nothing in his history that would think he would threaten to murder people for profit, right? I mean, look, again, I'll point this out again. Cooper was a bank robber. He just did it in a different way. Okay, so if you can't picture someone robbing a bank, then they're probably not DB Cooper.
Okay, though, and for anybody who wants to ask this question, if anybody is curious, do they have records of the ticket purchases going back to the 1970s, so to confirm somebody's whereabouts?
Oh, hell no.
Back to America? The answer is no, because I'll tell you, from looking into the Zodiac Killer mystery, people have tried to verify whereabouts, and as I understand, the archives only go back to the 1980s. Anything for the 1970s or 60s is just going to be out of the question, and sadly, those things are not archived. It's not like the ticket, like the people who sell airplane tickets are, trying to help out the true crime world or anything. But I mean, that's the answer to that is no, there are no records.
And Ned, it's even worse than that. We actually have in the FBI files where they were like, well, because they wanted to check with Northwest Orient to see, they asked them, we have this in the files where the FBI sends a memo to Northwest Orient saying, hey, do you guys have flight manifests for the previous 6 months, because they wanted to see if Cooper had done some dry runs. Okay. Because McCoy had done dry runs, by the way, before his hijacking. So they want to see if Cooper had done that too. And Northwest comes back and says, well, we only keep those for about a month. So, they were destroyed. I mean, they didn't have that stuff even a month later from when they would have flights. So yeah, good luck. I mean, they're damn sure not going to find that 50 years later.
Okay, then, if we can shift this rapid-fire discussion to a different direction, I would like to ask you about the DB Cooper skyjacking. Are you ready?
Yes, please.
And I'm going to borrow some things from Darren Schaefer, because he is really good at asking these questions on the Cooper Vortex. Yeah. And the first thing I would like to know is, did DB Cooper have a lot of not skyjacking, but did DB Cooper have a lot of skydiving experience?
So that is the one that really bugs me, because it's hard, because you would think that if he was a skydiver, so of the copycats can be very illustrative of some things. We've got 5 guys who did this. 5 guys, 16 guys tried, but 5 guys that actually managed to get money and jump out of a plane after Cooper. Only 2 of those guys were actual skydivers. Okay, the others had some parachute training. Except for Martin McNally, but the others had some parachute training, things like that. But we have 2 skydivers, okay, who did this, who were recreational skydivers, McCoy and a guy named Rob Hetty. Now, McCoy brought his own parachute, for one thing. He also, when he asked for parachutes, he specified what types of parachutes and where they would come from. He knew there was a place to get parachutes nearby in San Francisco. He said, I want 2 Paracommander parachutes from Perry Stevens's skydiving store, right? And so Hetty, the other guy, was actually already wearing his parachute under a blazer, or under a windbreaker. So he's already wearing his parachute when he didn't buy a ticket. He just jumped a fence and ran onto a plane that was boarding. But so the fact that Cooper just asked for parachutes, generic parachutes, seems like somebody who wouldn't have recreational skydiving experience, because he would just ask for a certain, I mean, it's like saying, think about this. It's like if you're able to get a getaway car, you're just saying, I want a car. Well, well, I mean, you have them by the balls, so to speak. You have a bomb on a plane. You can say, I want a Lamborghini, right? And they would give it to you. But he didn't. He said, he basically said, give me a getaway car. Give me a parachute. I want parachutes, just generic. So that kind of denotes inexperience with the recreational skydiving world, which is why people like Larry Carr and some of the people, and myself sort of, think he kind of comes from this quasi-military background. Like Air America is a company that was the CIA's company. They were there, that was their fake airline. And they had these guys who called cargo kickers. There were guys who would hang out in the back of these planes and shove packages out by parachute. And these guys are wearing, they're wearing military parachutes the whole time. And a lot of these guys were recruited from the ranks of smoke jumpers. So these guys were used to standing near the back of a plane that had the stairs open or whatever and wearing parachutes, but they weren't skydivers per se. Okay. So that's kind of, I feel like he had parachute knowledge, because we've got two guys who did not have parachute knowledge who did this. One is Paul Sini. That's the guy who came before Cooper. He had no idea what he was doing. It was apparent. Then we have Martin McNally, who jumped out with $500,000, who actually came to CooperCon last year. Martin McNally had never even put on a parachute in his life. And it was very apparent to the stewardesses that he had no idea what he was doing. Whereas Tina Mucklow said that Cooper put on a parachute like he had done it every day. So he seemed to be comfortable putting on parachutes, but didn't seem like a skydiver per se. So his parachute knowledge is sort of quasi. Remember, I mentioned earlier how he's kind of contradictory, a lot of the things about Cooper, and that's kind of one of the contradictions about him. He seemed to know what he was doing by doing this heist, but he also seemed to not know what he was doing by just saying, "Give me parachutes." Right.
The next question would be, if a suspect has blue eyes or green eyes, should they be eliminated? Because it sounds like you've said a couple different things in the interview so far.
Well, okay. Eye color is the weakest link as far as eliminating somebody. Now, granted, someone like Sheridan Peterson was fair skinned and had bright blue eyes, like really bright blue eyes. Vincent Peterson, bright blue eyes. Okay. But the only person who really noted his eye color was Florence. The only person we know of who noted his eye color was Florence Schaffner. And they were already in the plane at the time. Okay, when she saw him without his sunglasses on. And the plane isn't great lighting. It's not perfect. It's not bright, but it's not dark. But I have a hard time remembering. I could not tell you the eye color of some of my best friends if you asked me. Right? That's just not something you really pay attention to. But his eyes were darker. Okay, I mean green, hazel. I remember last year, Jude Morrow, who's an author of the book Dan Cooper, we were at CooperCon last year out drinking at one of the bars, and Jude just asked everybody at the table, he goes, "Hey guys, what is my eye color?" And everybody looked at him and said, "Brown." His eyes are green. And we're like, "Oh." Yeah, and I got up close to him. I was like, "Oh yeah, your eyes are green."
Absolutely.
So I don't put any stock in that unless it's like, and another thing too, that where I don't think his eyes were light colored is, think about this. Think about how striking it is when someone is dark complected who has blue eyes. Like, it's a real notable contrast that you note. You go, "Oh wow, that's very striking a look where someone looks really dark, yet they have blue eyes." That's a weird contrast. So I think that would be very memorable. To have, if you had blue eyes with that swarthy complexion that Cooper had, olive skin. So I do think he had. I mean, I think more than likely he did have brown eyes, just because, this guy is described as Latin looking. And, Latinos have brown eyes generally. So I think that, but yeah, eye color is the weakest link. I would never, and the FBI never eliminated anybody by eye color. I'll say that. Even blue-eyed people. Robert Rackstraw was not eliminated because he had green eyes. Jason Langseth, who I mentioned earlier, allegedly had blue eyes. Okay, and they didn't eliminate him for having blue eyes. So the FBI didn't eliminate people for eye color, and I don't either.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I mean, I doubt that Florence was trying to just download all this info and just trying to memorize his eye color.
Right.
And when you're just looking at somebody, you don't think to immediately hyper-analyze their eye color.
Sure.
And as you pointed out, people who have hazel eyes can easily be mistaken for brown. And
Yep.
I mean, I have seen people, though, who are, a very dark in complexion with blue eyes, like some African Americans, people from South Asia. I mean, like, even they can have blue eyes. It's possible. But I think you meant more that you would remember that, like, because that's such a strong contrast that it's not something you see every day. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, and it's just a notable look when someone has someone has bright eyes but has dark skin.
Okay,
it's contrast. It's memorable.
The next question is, was DB Cooper's bomb real?
I vacillate on this every day, it seems.
I do too, actually.
Yeah. Well, I would say this, that if it wasn't real, it was a very convincing fake, a unnecessarily convincing fake. He didn't need to even show it to him. In fact, some of the two of the copycat hijackers claimed to have a bomb and never even showed it to anybody. It's just, it didn't matter. Nobody's gonna like take the chance and be like, well, show it to me. Nobody's gonna do that. So he didn't need to do that. But a couple things. So people will say, oh, it's road flares. Well, road flares are long, actually. So when you open them, they don't burn your hand. Road flares are, a foot long, sometimes longer. These were 6 inches. Tina Mucklow gave a very good description of the bomb, because the thing about Tina is that Tina very rarely looked at Cooper directly. So she's seated next to him for all this time, and he has his hand in, and he keeps opening the bomb or the briefcase and putting his hand in, and I'm sure she's looking over at it a lot, because she's not looking at him, because she said she didn't want to antagonize him by looking at him. It's almost like if you're being robbed by somebody, somebody has a gun to you, it's best, law enforcement would say, avert your eyes. Like, don't look at them, because it puts them more at ease to know that you're not looking at them. So Tina was doing that on purpose. So she claims she didn't get a good look at Cooper, but she did get a good look at his clothing and his bomb, I think. So she described it. We actually have her describing it when Cooper sent her to the cockpit, and we have all the radio transcripts. If you want to read them, they're on my website norjack.org. I mentioned earlier. We have those transcripts, and as soon as she enters the cockpit, they're like, hey, have her describe the bomb to us. And she says, it's 8 sticks of dynamite, 4 on top of 4. They're wrapped in black electrical tape, and they have a wire going from them to a D-cell battery that is about the thickness of my arm, okay, which is like these old flashlight batteries from back then. And she says that the end of the wires are stripped. So that part always struck me, because like, that's a real attention to detail. Like, that's a commitment to your fake bomb if you strip the wires on the end of it. Like, that's unnecessary, really. But it's necessary if it's real, right? To have stripped wires to have a good connection. So she noticed that. Her father was an electrician, so she was very aware of things like this. And some Marines a while back, some Marines who did demolitions, actually set off a bomb a while back. They replicated the DB Cooper bomb, and it did explode. Okay, so it would have gone off. There is enough juice in a D-cell 9-volt battery to burst blasting caps on dynamite. So could have gone off. I just don't know why it didn't need to be real, but it looked damn real. And I would say also that Cooper continually told Tina, I'm not going to be taken alive. That's something that she remembered. He kept saying, I won't be taken alive. I'll die here. And a bomb is one way to kill yourself, for sure. If he was suicidal and didn't go to prison, that'll blow you up. And also it serves a purpose too. This is before DNA, so to be grim about it. If he had killed himself that way, well, they would never know who he was, right? They would never be able to ID him somehow back then. And I do know, and before anybody says, well, argues with me about this, there were hijackings back then where hijackers were killed, okay? And almost like you see the old pictures of the Wild West where they would like pose with the body almost, right? Jesse James or whatever. Like they literally would put these skyjackers' dead faces on the cover of newspapers back then, saying, do you recognize this person? So I think a bomb is one way to avoid that. If he didn't want to bring shame to his family or something, if something went wrong, that's one way to blow yourself up. So yeah, I kind of think it's real. I don't think it needed to be, but I would lean more toward real than not. What about you?
One thing hit me out of the blue one day. Like you said, I think about this every single day now. And one thing that just hit me was like, wait a second, what if it was real dynamite, but it wasn't completely configured in a way that could have exploded? And so and in some ways that would mean that it was a dud. It wouldn't have worked,
Sure.
but he made it look like it worked. And that's just something that struck me like a lightning bolt in the past. Even when I went on the Cooper Vortex, I was like, it's a dud. It's not real. He didn't need a real bomb. He could have done the skyjacking without a real bomb. But I lean more and more toward it being real because, as you just pointed out, number one, actually, I would cite Ryan Burns. Actually, I heard you on Planet X Filmworks once talking about this. The only thing that could signify is that what if Cooper just wasn't afraid to take his own life? Okay, yeah. He has a real bomb. And also leverage. I mean, if he's busted and he actually gets in a tough situation and he has a dud, well, he's screwed. And number three would be embarrassment and humiliation. If he gets, busted again and he has a fake bomb, well, then he's going to look like a dork. Whereas, I don't think Cooper was trying to look like a dork. I think he cared about the money, but I also don't think he wanted to make himself look bad. And you said it many times in this interview. DB Cooper was really trying to be cool, right?
He was seeming to. Well, I think I'm not saying cool in the sense that we think of cool. I would say he was trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. So he's in the back. He's slouching in his seat. Several passengers said he was back there slouching. Okay, so he's trying not to. He sits in the very back on purpose, right? Because no one noticed him because he's in the back of the plane. Okay, and he was the second to last to board, so he wanted to be not seen. Okay, now remember, they boarded not from the front but from the rear. So if you're Bill Mitchell came running up behind him, the college kid who comes to CooperCon. He'll be there this year. Come buy your CooperCon tickets. Come meet Bill Mitchell. He's a great guy. Bill Mitchell came running up because he was late. Well, he almost missed the plane. So Cooper may have been trying to be the last person to board because they're boarding from the back. So nobody's going to see him. And he's slouching the whole time, smoking, and he's enveloped in a cloud of smoke. Bill Mitchell mentions that. He says Cooper was annoying him before he even knew he was a hijacker because his cigarette smoke was blowing over in his face. So he's having to breathe Cooper's cigarette smoke. So he's being cool. But about the bomb too, I'll say this about dynamite. I did a lot of research on this, and I found an article. Dynamite was very easy to buy back then. In fact, you could buy it at like a hardware store, okay, or a drugstore even. Okay, there was an expose article. For those who are listening, go on Facebook and type in the official DB Cooper group, and that's my group. That's my Facebook group. I may post this later on, but I found an article from maybe 1970 where it was in Minnesota, I think. And they determined it was easier to buy dynamite than to get like headache medicine or something. So I mean, they went to a drugstore and were able to buy dynamite for like, I don't know how much it was. I mean, it was the equivalent of like, they bought like a dozen dynamite sticks for. I did the conversion. It was like $65 in today's money. I mean, just nothing. So you could have easily bought dynamite back then, especially in the Pacific Northwest. It was used a lot by farmers and people who had land to blow up beaver dams and to blow up stumps and things. Remember, this is a very wooded area, so they need to get rid of tree stumps and things. So they would use dynamite. So I mean, it's not preposterous. That's not a bad idea either, Ned. That it was real dynamite, but wasn't really configured, to actually explode. But I also did research too into other bombs that hijackers have used. I found it's all in my notes. It's going to be in my book. That something like I looked up like 12 different bomb scenarios for hijackers, and all of them, none of them even remotely seemed like Cooper's bomb. They were all like Roman candles in a brown bag, or just a bunch of rags in a bag, and the guy says, "Oh, this is a bomb," or a shoebox. One guy had a shoebox and said, "There's a bomb in here." So like Or, Martin McNally, who came to CooperCon last year, said he had a bomb. He didn't even have a bomb. He just said he had a bomb, in his carry-on, and that was enough, right? So Cooper was really dedicated to the performance art, if it was a fake, which makes me think it was probably real.
Okay, and as the interview is winding down, I would now like to give you the floor, Ryan Burns. Firstly, thank you for coming on Black Box Online Radio. And is there anything you want to promote? I know that you will have a book coming out in the future, and you also talked about your Facebook group already, but anything you would like to share with the audience of Black Box Online Radio in a concluding segment?
My YouTube channel, DB Cooper Sleuth. I hope most of your listeners, there's probably crossover already. But hope if you're not, go like and go subscribe to my page. And obviously, if you're listening and if you're listening and you are not subscribed to Black Box Radio, then please subscribe.
Thank you.
Ned's page as well. It does help a lot. People don't realize how it's free to subscribe, and it helps immensely. Subscriptions. But I would say that. But mainly, DB Cooper. We have the new DB Cooper conference is coming up in Seattle. So if you're a Seattle local, dbcooperevents.com, go to DB CooperCon. You can meet people who saw Cooper. They'll be there. Hopefully an FBI agent who was, I'm trying to get one of the original FBI agents who was there back in 71. He lives in Seattle. I'm trying to get him there. We're going to have Colleen Fitzpatrick who speaking there. She is essentially one of the world's foremost DNA experts. She is the founder of the Doe Project, who work with the FBI to close cold cases. So she has solved dozens of cold case murders. She solved the Somerton Man mystery. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about that. That's the guy who washed up or was found dead on the beach in Australia, I believe. Yeah. So she solved that. So she'll be there doing a speech. We're having an original Air America CIA cargo kicker, one of these guys who I think is sort of like Cooper a lot. One of those, he'll be there doing a speech. And again, we get to go on an original 727-100, which there are very few of those around. The DB Cooper plane was dismantled for scrap metal in like 1996. So a lot of these old planes are gone, but you can go on there and see how small it is. I looked at the blueprints one time recently of a 727 because I wanted to see how close everybody was. And I looked at the schematics and I measured everything out, and Bill Mitchell, the college kid who sat across from Cooper, his right, I actually texted him this. I said, Bill, did you know that your right elbow was 5 feet on the nose from Cooper's left elbow across the aisle? And I tell your listeners, get a tape measure and hold out 5 feet. That is not far, okay, at all. And that's how close he was for hours to Cooper. So, they were, real in close proximity to this guy. So you got really good looks at him as well. Bill's a great witness to Cooper. But no, I would promote that and just my YouTube channel, and really just people need to participate. And I would say go read the FBI files. They're fun. I mean, if you type in DB Cooper Vault, like VAULT, it pulls up all of these releases that they release every month, and they're highly redacted, a lot of them. But there's a lot of great info in there. And I'll also, again, point out norjack.org. I've got all these things I've talked about, these case files about Richard McCoy. They're all on there under the suspects part of my page. I've got the original radio transcripts on there. You can read for yourself and just read the witness reports. That's the main thing is people, it's this information is out there now. We don't have to watch National Geographic and go, oh, I wonder what this is. You can read it for yourself. We have the actual documents now. And they're all on my webpage, norjack.org. And I do have a book coming out at some point called DB Cooper, the FBI Files. Larry Carr is writing the foreword to it. Should be cool. And I don't know when that's going to come out. Probably in 2025, I would think early 2025. And that's really much it.
All right, Brian Burns, thank you so much.
All right, Ned. Thanks a lot, buddy.